Well, welcome everyone. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. John Lowe, who is our Associate Professor of Sanskrit since Michaelmas term 2019, so it's a recent and very precious acquisition. He obtained his DPhil here in Oxford with a thesis on the syntax and semantics of tense aspect stem participles in early Rigvedic Sanskrit, which I understand was the basis of his first book, published in 2015, here in Oxford also. That was followed by a monograph on transitive nouns and adjectives in Sanskrit and Pali, and also the Oxford Reference Guide to Lexical Functional Grammar. That's a very recent publication last year. And John's research interests include a lot of things, I have to say: Sanskrit language and linguistics, quite obviously, syntactic theory, formal semantics, Indo-Iranian comparative and historical linguistics, but also Greek and Latin, and so on and so forth. And he's sort of combining historical linguistics, but also with formal linguistic analysis, which is extremely interesting. And he's currently principal investigator on a 3-year Leverhulme Trust-funded project uncovering Sanskrit system. And I guess, is this related with today's talk to some extent?
No,
that's
really.
The next one.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Very good. And John will be in conversation with Professor Bjarke Frellesvig about that is the upcoming ERC project on the ancient Indian grammatical tradition and the discovery of interactions, influences, and connection with modern linguistics, which is very much in line with your research interests. So I'm very happy to leave the floor to both of you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. So yes, so I've worked for a long time in linguistics. I was in the linguistics faculty just over on Walton Street for several years, working, as you said, on theoretical linguistics primarily, alongside working on Sanskrit. And that's a happy combination, really, because of all ancient cultures, the most sophisticated and extensive work on linguistics and sort of academic thought on language analysis and the science of language was done in ancient India in Sanskrit, and with a particular regard to the Sanskrit language. So this tradition originated around, let's say, 1000 BC, and it culminated to some extent in the work of Panini, whose grammar, the Ashtadhyayi, maybe around 500 BC, remained the sort of the cornerstone of later work. But the tradition itself continued to develop at a high level, and integrating thought on the philosophy of language and meanings and so on, semantics, for at least another 1,000 years. So the last sort of great scholar in the tradition is Nagesha Bhatta, who's around 1700 AD. And the tradition itself continues today as a living tradition in India. Now, the sophistication of this tradition has been recognized in the West in modern times as well. So, for example, Noam Chomsky, who's sort of the who revolutionized linguistic analysis around 60 years ago, recognized that the revolutionary perspective that he had introduced in terms of how we do grammar and what linguistic analysis is about had to a large extent already been done by Panini in ancient India. The modern tradition has in different ways at different times adopted some major ideas from the Indian tradition as well. But of course, for obvious reasons, the details that most linguists working in linguistics don't know Sanskrit, and therefore they don't know the Sanskrit text. They don't really know what Panini says. They don't really know what the wider Indian tradition says. And in fact, even most Sanskritists don't really have a very good handle of what Panini says, and certainly not what the wider tradition says, particularly the later tradition. So there's an awful lot there that's under-researched, even within Sanskrit studies, in terms of these sort of later grammarians, but particularly also from a specifically linguistic perspective. So as I said, the Indian tradition has had significant influence at different points on the development of modern linguistics. So this began really around 200 years ago, let's say, with people like Franz Bopp, who learnt Sanskrit, didn't just learn Sanskrit, but learnt Parninian Sanskrit, partly through translations, or through grammars of Sanskrit, which were partly translations of native grammatical works. And so Franz Bopp kind of is in some ways the father of Indo-European philology, which is what ultimately morphed into linguistic analysis proper during the 19th century. Leonard Bloomfield, a major linguist of the 20th century, was heavily influenced by Parnini. He's one of the few scholars who knew Parnini and knew the Indian tradition relatively well and introduced some important concepts into linguistic analysis. And more recently as well, Paul Kiparsky is the main scholar who has an expertise in both areas. You know, you can count them on about one fingers of one hand. So there's an awful lot to research there, and what I want to do in my research is to both really go deeply into the later tradition. So Parnini himself has been very well researched, and that's where a lot of people stop because it's really very sophisticated, really very clever, really very interesting. But what comes after is also very interesting and builds on that in a number of ways and really needs to be researched in more depth. What I also want to do is look at it from a specifically linguistic perspective and say, well, not just understanding it in its own terms, but what can it tell us and what can it do for the tradition of modern linguistics, which, as I say, has sometimes adopted very significant advances directly from the Indian tradition. And there are various points where I think that particularly the later Indian tradition can give us new insights into particular questions which are still ongoing in modern linguistics.
Right. Thank you very much for this introduction. I've been so much looking forward to this that I have abstained from Googling anything about your subject on the internet. So I don't know anything about it because I wanted to learn about it here. I was asked in the lift coming up by our current faculty board chair whether Japan had an interesting native grammatical tradition, and I said no, not at all, and I suspected that was why I'd been picked to ask you questions about this. Japan is really void of any grammatical tradition of any significant standing in both length and quality. So the first question I wanted to ask you is what little there is in Japan is motivated by trying to figure out how to write poetry properly and things like that. Why did that tradition arise? What was the motivation? Because it's not obvious why one would start thinking about one's own language.
So the tradition really originated in the context of the Vedic text. So the Veda is the oldest Sanskrit literature. It was the earliest body of religious literature. Religious hymns and other texts which were composed, and then they were memorized and passed down through oral tradition, and partly just as a means of making sure that oral tradition was accurate, but also partly at a slightly later point in the context of language change and the fact that the language of the Vedas was no longer quite the language that the people were speaking. There was this concern to preserve those texts in their original form precisely. And that's where it really begins. So the very earliest, the earliest thing you could really call a sort of linguistic analysis is what's called the Padapatra of the Rig Veda, where the Rig Veda, this very early text, which would have been recited in continuous utterance, so without gaps between words, as we speak ordinarily, without gaps between words. A word-by-word version of that text was created. And it doesn't just break it down into words, it also does other, it marks other points of kind of linguistic analysis, such as compounds broken into constituent elements and things like that. So that's where it begins, and it really built from there in terms of developing a way to completely and accurately describe a language in such a way that you could learn and you could use that language using this grammar, even though that's not the language you grew up speaking anymore.
But there's still quite a jump from curating or preserving a lengthy document and making sure that it's recorded accurately, and then reflecting on the structure of the language. I would think. I mean, one thing is if you want to write down a text word by word, you need to have an idea of what a word is. And that itself is, of course, a theoretical consideration. But above that, where did it go? And
so, so it's, we're talking about a very long time, of course, and generations of people. And in terms of the early periods, we don't have a very good sense of what came before Panini in terms of the grammatical analysis, because his work was so complete and perfect, so the tradition says, that what came before was lost. But so the first development, I suppose, is to a point where you have this grammar of Panini. There were other traditions thinking about meaning, semantic analysis, traditions thinking about sound systems and sound analysis for the Vedic text. But grammar is what really kind of took off. And so Panini's grammar is something that to a large extent is intended to be sort of automatic. So if you know the rules and you know some principles about how to apply those, and you start with a meaning, you can build your sentence just by following these processes through fairly automatically. A bit like a computer system. You plug in the meaning and it will go through the various steps you've programmed it to do, and you'll get the right answer at the end. And that's the real sort of basis of then everything else depends on that to some extent. Wrestling with this grammar and what to do with it, and how well it works and whether there are problems in it, but also then building on that and sort of from maybe the 1st century BC or from maybe the 2nd century BC, integrating philosophical thought as well in terms of language analysis that was important in the philosophical schools at the time, particularly to do with meanings.
Right. Could you maybe sort of changing from why to maybe how, give us some insight into how this was expressed? Again, what little there is of a Japanese grammatical tradition uses everyday words like chord or decoration about grammatical items. What was the terminology used in this, and was it, how clearly is it set out? Do you need to have some kind of imaginative interpretation to understand what they're talking about, in which case you actually run the risk of imposing our understanding on it, or is it just very clearly set out like we would expect of a grammar today?
Yes, I mean, it depends a little bit on which text you're talking about at which period. I mean, if we look at Panini's Ashtadhyayi, there are some ordinary words that are used. For example, the word dhatu, root, is used for a verbal root, which is the basis of most words is a verbal root from which you build up verbs, of course, and then other things derived from verbs. So to a large extent, ordinary words are used, but they're invested with what is usually a clear technical definition, a clear technical sense. And given the sort of completeness of the system, a particular ordinary word is used, but it's very clear what it means. You don't need to have any imagination to interpret it. You could swap it for another word and the system would still work in the same way. And in Panini's system, there are also, in some cases, he will simply use a very arbitrary label for something, just a syllable like gu or gi, which isn't a real word. It's specifically not a real word, and that's just because it's just some arbitrary grammatical label that we invest with some particular function or meaning, and it makes the system work. So that's very technical.
So what does gu mean in his system?
Gu is, I'll get it wrong. Gu is either the I stems, isn't it? Yiming's here. Is gu the I stems or is that gi? Oh, gu is got da and da, yeah, and gi is the I stems, isn't it? Yeah, sorry. So gu is da and da, so two particular roots that share some properties and function in particular ways, and the other label is for a particular set of nominal declensions, if you like, that function in a particular way.
Right. So it's not that it will say like when the tiger leaves the yellow house as a way of explaining some grammatical process.
No. I mean, so some later texts. So another very important later text is the Vakyapadiyya by Bhartrhari, which is well, it's very important, but it's also very difficult. Partly for that reason, because he does use metaphors and similes and things. And exactly what he's trying to say is not always clear. The later tradition, particularly when they're talking about meanings and different ways of looking at meaning, they can stray into that kind of territory where it can be hard to know exactly what is meant. Yeah.
Okay. That must make some of it. Well, I mean that's what you're going to look at over the next. Is it 3 years?
5 years.
5 years. That must make some of that both interesting and difficult.
Yes.
You mentioned or maybe Martin mentioned in the blurb for this talk that this Indian tradition had achieved insights at a level that were not really reached until the middle of the 20th century in European linguistics, in which I include America. Could you give us some examples? All you've talked about until now has been, I think, word formation, of word classification and word formation. How about the sort of larger picture of syntax? You mentioned that Chomsky claimed to have knowledge of Panini.
Well, I think not knowledge, but he just acknowledges that he
was
someone had told him that.
That was probably Bloomfield then, who had told him. But could you give us some examples of the kind of insights that had eluded linguists in Europe until?
Sure. Okay. Yeah. So I suppose the Chomsky point, the point he's making is simply language as a kind of rule system, as the way he was envisaging it as a largely automatic rule system that you can apply in quite a computational way. You have your rules, you have your base elements, and you just apply it and get your right outcome. And that's a core part of Panini's grammar as well.
But couldn't you say that, for example, the new grammarians and their sound laws are exactly the same thing? You take something and then you apply some rules and then you get something else out of it.
Well, that's looking at a slightly different aspect of language, I suppose.
Yeah, but it's not a different way of looking at it, is it?
Well, I think the concept of these rules and laws in the neo-grammarians may well have also been influenced to an extent by the Indian tradition, because they were influenced as well, and of course many of them knew Sanskrit at that time. I suppose the point for Chomsky is that is how that's what linguistics should be aiming to do. That should be the goal of linguistic analysis, rather than something descriptive. Rather than saying here are the rules and this is how the language works, not just describing it, but actually setting up a system that can drive forward and produce sentences, which is a different way of looking at it. But something a bit more specific, which has been very important. So when you have a rule system, you have to know how those rules interact. So you could, for example, have a whole bunch of rules and they're all numbered 1 to 500 or something, and you just apply them in that order and everything works out right. But that isn't the way language works. You can't have or that's maybe not the most efficient way to write the grammar of a language. And it's certainly not the way Panini does it. So Panini has his rules, but they're not ordered in what we would think of as a logical way. Or they're not ordered linearly anyway. But you have rules in different places and you have to know how they interact. And so one thing is, well, what if you have two rules which can apply to a form and you don't know which one to apply? You can't apply both of them, but you need to know which one to apply. But in principle, there's a rule that's framed that could apply here and that you need it for other cases, and there's a rule frame that could also apply here, but which one do you do? So what's known in linguistics as the elsewhere principle, sometimes called Parnani's principle, sometimes referred to as blocking, is a really important principle that Paul Kiparski largely introduced into linguistics directly from Parnani. The idea that if you have two rules, it's usually the case, one rule will have a wider scope than the other. You have general rules and you have exceptions. For example, in English, your general rule is that the plural of nouns is in S. But you also have sub-rules that with a certain set of words, you use en as the plural, oxen and so on. And if you're formulating a grammar, the most efficient thing you want to do is you want to say that for the plural in English, you add S. You don't really want to say for this, this group of 10,000 nouns we use S, and for these 5 we use something else. You just want to say as a general rule for the plural use S. But you need some principle that you don't apply that rule in the exception cases. And this is the principle of blocking, that if there's a more specific rule that says with a certain set of 5 words we use en, or with a certain other set of words we change the vowel from foot to feet, that stops you from applying the more general rule. And that's a rule which has had massive importance, particularly in phonological analysis, so in the analysis of sound systems, since the late 60s onwards.
So it's first of all the sort of generative principle.
Yes,
that
Parnani
and that tradition formulated.
Yes, absolutely,
than in Europe and before Chomsky. So, for example, if we want to know something about English, it's really handy to know that the plural is generally formed by adding s, and that's the information we want. First of all.
Yeah.
However, if you're going to write a rule-based grammar, we would apply the other rules first. So they would, because that makes sense, you apply the specific rules first, and then you can apply the elsewhere rule at the end. You don't want to apply the elsewhere rule and then have to unpick applying that.
Yeah.
So does he take account of, because that's one interesting thing about generative grammar, if you do it properly, you have to have the specific rules first. Does he think about it that way?
Well, I suppose the general rule is often, but not always, given before the exception. But it's not about ordering specifically. So I suppose it depends exactly how you look at it. Right? I mean, you could do it that way, and there are different ways to approach this. And I suppose it depends how you deal with exponents. So if you have a word which you want to mark as plural, and then you mark it as plural using en or something, does that satisfy the requirement for plural so that when you get to your general rule, that no longer applies? Well, it could be, or it could just be that word is still plural, so when you get to your general rule, you still want to apply it, and you'd end up with oxens and feets and things like that.
Or maybe more to the point, you end up with children, which...
well, historically is a double one, yes. Yeah. And of course, that's what speakers do, but it's of course not the way we do language synchronically. So in any case, order could work given a certain approach and certain other assumptions to how you kind of build up words and what you do with those features. But you don't need order. You can, if you have this principle of blocking, it doesn't actually matter when you apply the general rule or when you apply the specific rule, because that principle will apply and prevent you from applying the general rule.
But I think until recently in generative or transformational grammar, whatever we call it, the idea of having ordered rules was extremely important, and certainly it was for Chomsky in 1957 when he wrote syntactic structures. So maybe Panini was just way ahead of Chomsky.
Maybe, yeah. I mean, so I suppose where this really plays out is sort of lexical phonology and Paul Kiparski's work. So where you have rule groups that are ordered with respect to one another, but within those rule groups, you can apply those rules. And the other thing is you can go back and you can apply. You can go back and you have this principle of cyclicity that you can apply go back and apply a rule again, or apply a rule from an earlier level to it, if need be. So that's where you're kind of going to get problems with ordering, I think.
So I think one of the things that was not accounted for in Chomsky's work at all, I think, and only recently in some versions of generative linguistics, is the idea of markedness, which will account for how the rules are applied. Is that something that Panini or that tradition have addressed in a form that we can recognize? So marked versus unmarked, and what markedness actually is.
I suppose only in the sense of a default and then an exception to it, but beyond that, no, I can't think of a way that has been dealt with in a kind of beyond that principle. But there may be something.
Well, I think it's good to know that things have moved forward since.
Yes, of course,
1000
yeah.
BC. And I think we probably also need to move forward in the sense of wrapping up this part of the proceedings and moving on to the second part. But thank you very much for sharing your work with us, and I find it very, very interesting and instructive, because, as I said, I didn't know anything about it until we started talking about this half an hour ago. But now I know a little bit more about it, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Right, so, well, there are 3 minutes left, so I'm afraid maybe it's a bit too short to have questions from the audience. Or maybe we can have 1 or 2, I don't know.
I think from
Well,
If there is one burning question.
maybe, yes. Because they need to, okay, Ulrike then, go on.
No, one thing that always impressed me very much is this Panini appearing, say, around 500 BCE, and you mentioned that before that what we know is that, there was the Patapata, let's say 1000 BCE, so many centuries before Panini. And Panini's grammar has this really complicated code system of all this really complex grammatical terminology. It was composed at a time when there was no writing system in India, so it must have been composed orally and memorized orally. It's still memorized today, we know that, but it must have been created orally as well. And that is always something that fascinated me, and I was wondering what you imagine how that worked. Do you think there was this one genius who was sitting down and inventing all of this as a system? Or do you assume that there was a longer tradition before Panini, that it was developed slowly, and that he just summarized what was there?
Yeah, I think both of those things. I mean, there was definitely a longer tradition, and there are traces of that in the later Vedic literature, in the Brahmanas and the Upanishads, where they mention linguistic analysis of various sorts. It's just traces of it, but we know that was happening.
Does that include these abbreviations that Panini uses?
No, we don't get signs of that. No. But I think that's such a core part of the system that it must have been there for quite a long time. And the use of the anubandhas, for example, the code markers, that can't have been added at a later point. But it is clear when you look at the Ashtadhyayi that there's a sort of a period of composition. There are things that are earlier and things that are later in it. Some of the terminology is clearly earlier, some of the terminology is clearly later. It even seems to be the case that some suffixes have been added into the system at a later point, and they end up slightly contradicting things that from an earlier period. So there's clearly a longer tradition there. So for example, for the instrumental singular, has 2 different names. One of them seems to be the older name, one of them seems to be the younger name, but they're both used in different rules. And so I think that shows that something like that system must have existed for at least more than just a single generation. But clearly, the perfection or almost perfection of the Ashtadhyayi and its completeness and so on, it seems reasonable to attribute to one person. I don't see any reason to doubt that. There's no evidence against it being a single person who kind of brought it all together and made it so brilliant in the end.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, John.